Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. I'm also our Senior Associate for South Asia. Thank you all for coming. Before I forget, I would like to thank two key partners. One is the Wilson Center's Middle East program, our institutional co-sponsor. And I would also like to thank Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, our external partner for this event, and particularly my friend Mohammed Tahir over here from RFE-RL. The Wilson Center has enjoyed its earlier collaborations with you, and we hope for more. For those of you who may be here for the first time, just a very quick word about the Wilson Center, so please bear with me. We are chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. And in the spirit of President Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, we build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy to inform and develop solutions to the nation's problems and challenges. So that was a mouthful. I'm glad that we had that out of the way. Our topic today is one that gets a whole lot of play in this town, and that is the issue or the challenges of extremism and terrorism in Pakistan. In recent months, Washington has focused its strategic lens, relatively narrowly on the issue of the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network, which, according to the U.S. government, uses safe havens in Pakistan to plan and stage attacks on U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And what we plan to do today is widen that lens just a bit and look at what lies beyond the issue of Afghanistan-focused militants on Pakistani soil. We're going to try to provide a bit more context. The picture of extremism and terror in Pakistan is not only complex, but it is also evolving and changing, arguably both for the better and the worse. For example, terrorist violence is down. Last year, according to the South Asia Terrorism Portal Network, portal database, there were 540 civilian deaths from terrorist violence in Pakistan. That is a whole lot, though much less than the nearly 1,800 in 2014, the year that the Pakistani army launched a counterterrorism offensive in North Waziristan. At the same time, terrorist attacks, particularly in the western parts of the country, in the tribal areas, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province and Balochistan province, do continue. A variety of bad actors, not just the Haqqani network and its ilk, but also India-focused groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed continue to have a presence in Pakistan. Newer groups, such as ISIS, have now arrived in the region. And you also have a new phenomenon of hardline Islamist political parties, including ones with ties to Lashkar-e-Taiba, known as the Mili Muslim League, participating in the political process. And these parties do enjoy a fair amount of support within society. Some of you will recall that a Mili Muslim League candidate received nearly 6,000 votes in a by-election in Lahore in September, which was more than 4 times the number of votes that the Pakistan People's Party candidate received. Another of these parties led a sit-in in Islamabad in November that paralyzed the city for about 2 weeks. And more broadly, there has been criticism from some in Pakistan and many more outside of it that the state continues to be selective in its crackdowns on militant groups, even as it intensifies crackdowns on critics of the state within civil society and on social media. So there's a lot going on, and the plan this afternoon is to try to make a bit of sense of it all. So we'll assess some recent developments and perceptions in Pakistan as they relate to extremism and terrorism. We'll look at how state and society are linked to and shape extremism and terror. And we'll try to assess where things may be going in the future. So we've got a great group of panelists to discuss these complicated issues. I'll very briefly identify them in the name that in the order that you'll hear from them. First, Dawood Khattak, who is our colleague from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He's a Pakistani journalist and a senior editor of RFE-RL's Pakistan service, which is known as Radio Mashal. Uh, we also have with us Dr. Madiha Afzal, who is a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution, and she's also an adjunct assistant professor of global policy at SAIS. She recently published a very well-received new book called Pakistan Under Siege: Extremism, Society, and the State, which she will be discussing this afternoon. There are flyers about it outside. And finally, Dr. Stephen Tinkle is an assistant professor at American University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He published what's regarded as one of the seminal books on Lashkar-e-Taiba back in 2011. He was here at the Wilson Center in 2012 as a public policy fellow. His time here led to the publication of a study on militancy, homegrown militancy in India, and his latest book is called With Us and Against Us: How America's Partners Help and Hinder the War on Terror, which will be published soon, in the next few months. April, next few weeks. Excellent. So with that, I'm going to turn things over. We're going to move on in just a moment. None of you really came to hear me this afternoon, but just very briefly, in terms of the format, we'll hear brief comments from the three speakers, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion. Finally, this event is being live streamed, and those of you watching or online and those of you here, feel free to live tweet the event. The hashtag we're using is Pakistan Extremism, all one word. So with that, before we go to Dawood, Atif, we're gonna have you start a video. We're gonna have a very short video that will lead to Dawood's comments. So.
December 2007. A suicide bomber detonates himself during the Eid prayers, one of Islam's most important holidays. 55 men and children die. Scores are injured. Almost all of the victims are from one small village. This documentary revolves around three sisters. The eldest sister's son was getting married. The Taliban exploded a remote-controlled bomb on a vehicle carrying the family, killing 18. Zubaydah lost her 4 sons, a daughter-in-law, and 3 grandchildren. Zakia is Zubaydah's daughter. Injured in the attack, she cannot walk properly or fold her leg and has difficulty doing chores. January 2010. In a village famous for producing volleyball players, a Taliban truck explodes in the middle of a final match. 120 die, mostly young men and children, including all of the volleyball players. 200 are injured. Why? The village was punished for its peace committee and resistance to the Taliban expansion. September 2013. A suicide bomber attacks a vehicle carrying a family traveling to invite relatives to their son's wedding. 19 family members are killed. Nazakat survived and is now raising 12 orphans.
There you go.
Dawood, yes, return to you.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here again. I was here first time April 2017, I guess. These documentaries are just part of Radio Mashal Countering Violent Extremism project, and each documentary is 22 minutes. The purpose of its showing is just to take a cue that what was happening in Pakistan only a few years ago. If we go back to the history of from 2007 to 2013, almost every week there was a blast in cities or in villages or in towns. Since then, after the launch of Operation Zarb-e-Azb in 2014, the Pakistani security forces successfully defeated the Taliban and expelled them from the tribal areas. Right now, when we are looking at the situation in the tribal areas as well as in the cities, we don't see the organizational structure of the Pakistani Taliban, which is called the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. And that is of course, anyone who is following the situation in Pakistan, they will call it a bigger success and a bigger victory. Because as I recall from my reporting time in Peshawar, in the years of 2007, 8, and 9, every morning when we were waking up, we were fearing that the Taliban might be somewhere in the city. So that was the situation. Now, when we look at the situation in Pakistan, people's confidence is very much restored. There was time in 2009, 10, 11, 12, when businessmen were packing up their businesses from Peshawar and they were moving to other cities because of the security situation. It's improving, but the bigger challenge now for the Pakistani government and Pakistani security forces is how to stop the spread of extremism in the society. And extremism spread in the society because of the presence of Taliban for years, because of the Afghan war in the neighborhood in Afghanistan, because of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, and after the 9/11, the entry of Al-Qaeda and a host of other militants that created the Pakistani Taliban, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. And since then, the extremism spread into the villages and towns. I will give you one very recent example of the extremism which I can call a bigger challenge for the Pakistani government. In April last year, the students of a university, they killed one of their colleagues on charges of blasphemy. His killing was celebrated in some areas. Even the religious leaders of religious parties, they celebrated the killing. Later on, the issue was raised on the social media and it was taken up by the Pakistani electronic media, and around 57 people were arrested on charges of involvement in the killing. On February 7, only a few days ago, a Pakistani court issued its decision regarding the killing of their student. One person was sentenced to death, 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and 25 to 5 years imprisonment. 26 were released. The very next day, the religious parties, some leaders of the religious parties, and those were the religious parties who are taking part in the Pakistani democratic system. They believe in the sanctity of vote. They welcome the students, and they welcome the people who were released. And they again condemned that student who was killed on false charges of blasphemy. That is the level of extremism. And that is the bigger challenge for the Pakistani authorities. Because if we look at the battlefront victories, it's very much successful. We don't see the organizational structure of Taliban in the Pakistani areas. But if we look at the level of extremism in the Pakistani society, it's really a bigger challenge. And when we are speaking of how to counter extremism, we can go back to December 2014, when the Pakistani Taliban launched an attack on a military-run school, and 140 children were killed. Just 2 days after that attack, the military and civilian leadership came together, and they devised a strategy. It was 20 or 21-point agenda, which is called the National Action Plan. It's also called in the Pakistani terminology NAP. That NAP was a compact strategy how to counter extremism in Pakistan. Unfortunately, for reason better known to the authorities, steps were not taken against the spreading trends of extremism, be that in the political parties or in the society. We can see that groups which are banned by the United Nations or which are banned by the Pakistani authorities, they are holding their meetings, they are holding their corner meetings, they are holding their protest rallies. And similar, the one protest that we have seen only a few days ago after the release of those students from prison, that was also against the National Action Plan of Pakistan, which is a strategy against countering extremism. We don't see any kind of action. Whether the Pakistani authorities are incapable or they don't want to do something, that's a question for the authorities. Many people who are following the situation in Pakistan, they may have read about a recent protest demonstration in the from the youth of the tribal areas. And many people who are following the tribal areas, they know it only as the breeding grounds of the Taliban, only as the supporter of the extremists. Now, we can better understand that how awareness prevailed among the tribal areas and how the people of the tribal areas or how the youth of the tribal areas are against the extremists or against the Taliban. They led a protest demonstration to Islamabad, and their demands were to stop extrajudicial killing, to recover all the disappeared people, the missing persons, to end the military checkposts. So their voice was, and they were saying no to terrorism and extremism. That is providing a proof that the tribal youth are more aware as compared to 2001 or after that when the Taliban were taking roots in that area. One thing was very popular in that many people say that their protest was against the Pakistani government. Yes, of course, it was against the Pakistani government and the Pakistani security forces. They were asking them to remove the military checkpost or recover the disappeared people. But it was not against the state of Pakistan, for example. Some people on the social media, I was seeing that they were coloring the protest as something anti-Pakistan. It was not anti-Pakistan. The tribal youth were chanting that they are the citizens of Pakistan, but they want justice inside the Pakistani state, from the Pakistani government. We can go ahead with that. I must be brief, this is why I am rounding up everything. So my point is that security situation in Pakistan is very much improved as compared to the past few years. But the challenge remains, and that is the challenge of how to counter and how to stop the spread of extremism in the country. Just a few words about Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there is a new phenomenon now of the Islamic State. Just only 2 years ago, the Islamic State were holding control in around 11 districts of eastern Afghanistan. Now their control is only restricted, as per media reports, and we are speaking to people on the ground, it is restricted to only 4 districts in Afghanistan. But since the regional powers, Afghanistan neighbors, and the international community, so far they are failed to agree on a single point agenda on Afghanistan, how to restore peace there. I can label this struggle of these countries and the regional power and the international community as a struggle for individual conquest, not as a struggle to defeat the Taliban. Because all of the international, the big powers, they are trying to win and they are trying to safeguard their own interests. The regional powers are trying to safeguard their own interests, and the neighbors are trying to safeguard their own interest. The ultimate result is the continuation of war in Afghanistan. And the ultimate beneficiary of that war is the newly emerging Islamic State and the already existing Taliban group. As long as the war in Afghanistan remains, there will be very weaker possibility of a permanent peace in Pakistan, particularly in the tribal and the border areas, and there will be very weaker possibility of how to counter extremism because these two countries are very well connected with each other. And we are witness to a very recent attack on the Pakistani security forces in Swat region, where the Pakistani conducted a very successful operation and they expelled the Taliban. So my point is that the bigger challenge for the Pakistan and the bigger challenge for the international community is how to restore peace in Afghanistan, and for the Pakistanis, how to counter extremism inside its own borders. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daoud. Let's move on to Madiha Hafsal.
Is this automatic? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I may periodically cough, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm just recovering from an illness which seems to have gripped most of the DC area. So I want to sort of make 4 points that will link to each other. And I initially want to start off by talking about attitudes of Pakistanis, of regular, ordinary Pakistanis. So the perception we have about the attitudes of Pakistanis is that they are supportive of terrorist groups, or that they condone, if not celebrate, violent jihad. That's kind of the perception in the West when we think about Pakistanis. But a look at the data tells us that this is not the case. This does not hold true. So, I want to lay out the baseline of Pakistanis' attitudes. So 89% of Pakistanis in a Pew Global Opinion poll said that they thought that violence against civilians in the name of Islam was never justified. Not just not justified, was never justified. Pakistanis, on the whole, also tend to be, on net, unfavorable towards terrorist groups, not just those that strike Pakistan itself, but those that strike even, what Pakistan considers to be its enemies. So, of 4 terrorist groups that I examined, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, Pakistanis, on the whole, there were some Pakistanis who had favorable views towards these groups, others who had unfavorable views towards these groups, and others who did not respond to the question because of fear or ambivalence, or just because they didn't know enough about the group, right? We can't unpack that. But on net, Pakistanis were always more unfavorable towards these groups than were favorable. In fact, very small minorities were favorable towards these groups. The third thing that I want to highlight in this sort of the attitudes bit is that the unfavorability or negative views towards terrorist groups increased in response to the terror that struck Pakistan over the last 10 years. So Pakistanis became negative not just towards the Pakistan Taliban that struck them, but also towards Al-Qaeda and the Lashkar-e-Taiba, towards groups that didn't strike Pakistanis directly. So that's sort of a positive side to the story, right? Of course, when you start unpacking narratives, things don't look quite so simple. So I interviewed students and teachers in schools and colleges in Pakistan. And when you start asking them about their narratives on, or their views on the Pakistan Taliban, what you uncover is a more complicated picture. So there are two sort of narratives on the Pakistan Taliban. Again, the group that was striking Pakistanis with great force when I was interviewing these students, 2013, 2014, and then also early 2015. The first narrative, and I'll actually read a couple of quotes to you, which will make sort of those narratives apparent. Here's one by a student I interviewed. He said, we say bomb blasts are done by the Taliban, but the major cause is the Americans and the Indians, the American agencies and the Indian agencies. So that points to a conspiracy theory argument, pointing the finger of blame elsewhere. And that can be kind of a direct conspiracy theory argument, as this student pointed out, or it could be in the form of linking the Taliban to sort of justifiable, in their view, attacks because of US action against them in the tribal areas, or US action against the Afghan Taliban, which they consider to be themselves to be affiliated to. So a high school teacher told me that I asked him about the causes of terrorism in Pakistan. He said, I was taking notes. So he said, write down CIA, Mossad, RAW. I will not say Taliban, because the day we stop drone attacks, they will stop terrorism, right? So that's sort of one end of the argument. The other end is what a high school teacher told me, again about the Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban. They want Islam too. It is the duty of Muslims to spread God's words. They are just fulfilling their duties. Now you can call them either terrorists or jihadis. So that points to the idea that there is some sympathy for these groups because there is sympathy for their cause. And their cause is considered to be the establishment of an Islamic system, or Sharia, which is what the Pakistan Taliban was claiming in Pakistan. So sort of both of these narratives point to a more complicated story. All right. Still talking about attitudes, the other thing I want to highlight about attitudes is attitudes on things like blasphemy. All right, so I'll talk very briefly in a minute about Pakistan's blasphemy law, but again, just laying out attitudes. 75% of the Pew respondents that I looked at in most recent years said that blasphemy laws are necessary to protect Islam in Pakistan. 75% also favor the death penalty for converts who leave Islam. Okay, so again, sort of paints a negative picture, paints a picture that signifies intolerance in the country. Finally, when we just one quick point, when I note, while views towards the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Al-Qaeda are negative, when you sort of press Pakistanis about their views on the US and India, they're obviously also very negative. So there's some latent sympathy, not for the violence that these groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Al-Qaeda, have engaged in, but for the goals or for their ideologies that they ascribe to. All right, so that's sort of a layout of Pakistanis' attitudes. Well, where did these attitudes come from? So the answer, which my book sort of walks through, is that they were engendered in many ways, not through a direct brainwashing, but through decades of the Pakistani state's deliberate actions. And these actions and these policies are those that are related to its education system. So the curricula that the Pakistani state has put in place, the official curricula, which sort of I go into this in a lot more detail, obviously, in the book, but which glorify jihad, which argue for conspiracies against Pakistan, and so on. And they also go back to Pakistan's laws. So Pakistan has blasphemy laws that basically, I'll very quickly sort of read out part of the blasphemy law that Pakistan has to you. Clause 295C that was inserted in Pakistan's Penal Code in 1986 criminalizes derogatory remarks against the Prophet. So any remarks, and it's not specified what these remarks are, if they're considered offensive to the Prophet, Muhammad, they are, and now I quote, they are to be punished with death or imprisonment for life and shall also be liable to fine. So when you criminalize remarks against when you criminalize remarks that are considered as blasphemy to the extent that they are punishable by death as sort of the number one outcome, it is no wonder that we have a population that has taken to vigilante violence. In fact, before the 1980s, there were hardly any cases of vigilante violence in Pakistan. The numbers are less than 100, right? After the 1980s, so between 1987 and 2014, 1,300 plus Pakistanis have been accused of blasphemy. The numbers on vigilante violence aren't as clear, but there has been a great deal of vigilante violence against those accused of blasphemy. All right, so where do, why has the state done this? Well, this goes back to Pakistan's very inception. And the two narrative pillars that the Pakistani state defined for itself. And those two narrative pillars were sort of a definition of itself as based on Islam and a definition of itself as a country that is in opposition to India. So Pakistan defines itself as an Islamic state that lives in sort of existential fear from India. And those two pillars have defined the actions that the Pakistani state has taken, not just in sort of its education system, its legal system, but also in terms of supporting the Afghan jihad, in terms of supporting Kashmiri jihadists, and in terms of the kind of obfuscated narrative that it has on terrorist groups. So Baitullah Masood, who went on to become one of the leaders of the Pakistan Taliban, in 2005, a Pakistani military general, General Safdar, when the Pakistani military was kind of trying to engage with this growing insurgency in the tribal areas, called Baitullah Masood not a rebel, but a patriotic citizen and soldier of Pakistan. So the idea was that these were our brothers, right? And they could be contained. All right, so I'll move on. So that's sort of where this has come from, the role of the state. I'll move on to sort of the third point that I want to make, which is sort of, which Daud touched on, which is looking at post 2014. So in Pakistan, really, it seemed like December 2014, the Army public school attack, which killed 130 school children, was really sort of a moment of clarity. It seemed at the time that Pakistan had finally turned a corner, right? The National Action Plan included not just it included elements of, sort of hard action against terrorist groups, hanging of terrorists, and so on. But it included softer measures that would counter extremism in the country's religious seminaries or madrasas. It would counter extremism in sort of the propaganda that's out there, that would be curtailed. It would counter extremism on the television and radio airwaves, at mosque loudspeakers, and so on, right? So that's what it seemed to aspire to. But very quickly, we have reached a point, 3 years on, where while there has been some good actions that have been taken, right, or at least lip service in some ways, that has been paid to protections for minorities or celebrating minorities. There was a Christmas peace train that was launched. I was in Lahore a year ago around Christmas time, and Lahore looked very festive with Christmas trees all around. A Christmas peace train was launched in Islamabad. Nawaz Sharif, the then prime minister, kept talking about Jinnah's Pakistan, which was sort of his vision of a pluralistic Pakistan. But those are words with some action. What we have seen since then, and even before then, is no action on the Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? And the Afghan Taliban, even though the government is claiming that it's sort of taking action against the Haqqani network now under pressure, but we can discuss that later. More action against secular bloggers who have been disappeared, right? That's a term that is used, and it's used passively because we don't know who disappeared them. But the secular bloggers were disappeared last year. Early last year, they're considered more of a threat in many ways than Hafiz Saeed, the head of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, or Abdulaziz, the militant head of Islamabad's Red Mosque. So that has happened. A terrorist, a former terrorist now, named Ehsanullah Ehsan, who was the spokesperson of the Pakistan Taliban, was actually paraded in front of the country, sort of, and on TV, basically gave interviews blaming India for supporting the Pakistan Taliban. We have seen vigilante violence continue, and this new group, or this militant group or this fundamentalist group with increasing clout, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Ya Rasulullah, which held Islamabad under siege literally for a few weeks at the end of last year, had all of these demands that basically asked for the government not to make any change in the blasphemy law, and the government, instead of countering this group, right? Instead of countering their narrative, actually gave into it and gave into their demands. We have seen the militant Madrasa Darul Uloom Haqqaniya stay open and in fact get 300 million rupees in funding last year, allocated from the budget in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. My RA went to an old bookshop in Old Lahore and found militant propaganda from the Lashkar-e-Taiba, just lying there celebrating ISIS's victories in Iraq. So why is all of this happening? Well, because the Pakistani state doesn't see this form of extremism as a threat. It thinks that it's countered, it's sort of taken kinetic action against the Pakistan Taliban, and with sort of its two big sort of ominously named military operations, the Zarb-e-Azb and the Raddul Fasad, and it thinks its job is done. And it still thinks of India as sort of the main threat to it. What it does not understand is that the concept of jihad is unwieldy. These ideologies are unwieldy. The foot soldiers of these militant groups sort of move around. And so, because it relies on the same two pillars that have propelled it forward since its independence, Islam and the anti-India narrative, it doesn't recognize sort of these behaviors as a threat. So I'll end by sort of my point number 4. I'm aware that I need to sort of wrap up. I'll end by talking about, what can the U.S. do in given all of this, right? Given that this is the Pakistani that the Pakistani state's behavior is not based on sort of short-term concerns, but this kind of deep-rooted narrative that it's built for itself, that has dictated its behavior. Honestly, America should not expect Pakistan to change unless something deeper within Pakistan changes. Pakistan will take some action. We saw this even, we've seen this post-2014. Pakistan will take the action it needs to survive. But until it recognizes the Lashkar-e-Taiba, until it recognizes the Haqqani network, until it recognizes these deeper forms of extremism as an existential threat to itself, right? It's not going to change its calculations based on the threat that these organizations pose to other countries. In fact, the threat that those organizations pose to other countries, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, for instance, in particular, is what allows Pakistan to maintain this kind of strategic balance in its eyes in the region, because the threat of the militant Lashkar-e-Taiba is what allows Pakistan, a much weaker state relative to a much larger enemy, to keep India at bay. So if that's bad news, we don't expect things to change. What can be done? I would argue that the cutting off of military and security assistance to Pakistan is a fine step, right? Because without the bluster that it came with. But otherwise, it's a fine step because it's Pakistan's military in particular and Pakistan's security establishment that really believes in the notion of these sort of Kashmiri jihadists and so on. Its civilian government is the hope for a more tolerant future for Pakistan. So not cutting off civilian aid is really going to be key. Engagement with the civilian government to prop it up, to give it more power vis-a-vis the military is important. And engagement with Pakistan's population is also important because the kind of bluster that's gone on from this end so far has been unhelpful, to say the least, in engaging the Pakistani population. And I think the final point I'll make is that making Pakistan realize or making Pakistanis realize, I'm sure there are elements in the security establishment who understand this, but making some Pakistanis who don't, and sort of the layman, understand how sort of jihadists in Pakistan can harm it, even though right now they may not seem as harmful to the Pakistani state themselves. How these forms of extremism, such as support for the blasphemy law, can harm it, even though, again, they may not think of these things as existential threats. That is really the key, and that's where we can help. Right.
Well, thanks, Medea, for the smart but very sobering appraisal. Let's go to Stephen, who will sort of discuss where this could all perhaps take us in the future.
Sure, great. First, let me just say thank you to Michael and to Wilson Center for having me here. And it's great to be literally surrounded by such great panelists. Dawood is somebody who I have followed for a long time on Twitter, and if you don't and you're on Twitter, you should. And he's somebody that, when I've had questions about the nitty-gritty of dynamics within TTP or Pakistani Taliban, I've reached out, thinking that I was going to maybe get back a couple lines, and I think I got back a couple pages. Incredibly knowledgeable and helpful. And Medea's done, I think some fantastic work on mapping not just the attitudes and the narratives in Pakistan, but really getting at where they come from and where they're going. And if you haven't bought and read her book, then you should. My job, I think, here today is to talk about where this might head in the future and what it means for the United States. So I'm going to start by just sort of talking about how I see the militant universe there potentially evolving, building on what the other panelists have said, and then turn briefly to kind of what that augurs for the United States. There's a lot of different ways that we can categorize militant groups in Pakistan, and I think it is helpful to put them in buckets, even if those buckets overlap, partially because I'm an academic and we love to categorize things, but also because it does help us give a sense of where change is occurring. If we were having this event, 5 years ago, and we were talking about anti-state groups, which is the first category that I'll discuss. The really anti-state factions of the TTP, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. I would drop Al Qaeda in that, ISKP since it's arisen. 5 years ago, we would be having a very, very different conversation. 2014 wouldn't have happened yet. The attack that Medea was talking about, Zarb-e-Azb wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't necessarily be at a point where we are now, where I think anti-state militants, although they have not by any stretch of the imagination been defeated, they have certainly been degraded. Pakistan has not won that fight, but it is winning to the degree that it certainly appears to have the upper hand against the anti-state militants that were actively launching attacks against the state. And I think in the near term, we shouldn't necessarily expect that to change. The fact of the matter is, Pakistani army and intelligence services are, quite robust, at least in terms of capacity, and over the years they've developed better capabilities. One of the reasons why I think militants were able to run riot for so long is because this threat wasn't taken seriously for so long, as we heard back in 2005 talking about people like Baitullah Masood as our brothers. And it really wasn't until the end of the decade, that I would argue that the army and the intelligence services got their act together. And they, Pakistan is a strong enough state militarily and in terms of its security services that I don't think we should expect a reversal of fortunes anytime soon. But there's a couple of caveats to that I think are important to mention and things that we should keep an eye out for. The first is what happens in Afghanistan. Right? One of the ongoing sort of arguments that I have had with Pakistani colleagues, especially in the security establishment, is that they seem, on the one hand, to be very, very concerned about potential violence coming from Afghanistan, and at the same time, sometimes I feel like they haven't made the connection that what you send across the border into Afghanistan won't necessarily stay there and could come back to Pakistan. And so to the degree to which, Afghan is further destabilized, that can have potential ramifications for Pakistan in terms of how anti-Pakistan elements in Afghanistan are able to use sanctuaries there, and the potential for a regeneration of proxy conflict, which has been going on and off for some time now. It's important to note that when I talk about proxy conflict, that Pakistani interlocutors from the military and intelligence services and security establishment and others like to try to, draw, a false equivalency here. What Afghan intelligence and Afghan security services have done in terms of support for some elements of the Pakistani Taliban pales in comparison to what Pakistan has provided to the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network. Nevertheless, when we're talking about the potential for a regeneration of or a growth of the insurgency in Pakistan, I think we have to keep an eye out for not just the degree to which sanctuary is on offer in Afghanistan, but also the potential for growing support from actors there. The second caveat that I just want to mention is the issue of internet-based radicalization. For a long time, recruitment in Pakistan, to the degree that the internet has been involved, it hasn't been necessarily the huge recruitment tool I think that we've seen in some other places. And one of the reasons for that is that, plenty of militant groups were running around and they controlled they sort of had their own, if they didn't control territory, they had places where they operated and so that they were able to recruit. And the internet was part of that. But, at the end of the day, you had Jaish-e-Mohammed recruiting grounds, in Bahawalpur, and environments around that. You had Lashkar-e-Taiba recruiting grounds, which for a long time overlapped with the Army's recruiting grounds, was really interesting, You had places where, different TTP factions were recruiting, what have you. I'm happy to sort of get into those recruitment patterns during Q&A if people are really interested in geeking out on that. If what we're seeing in Kabul, for example, is any indication where we're beginning, the reports coming out are that some of the attacks there were undertaken by middle-class Afghans who were radicalized online and more of a global mindset as opposed to a local mindset. And that is something that finds a foothold in Pakistan as well. Then I think that's another issue that Pakistan is going to deal with. And I think that gets to some of the issues that Medea was talking about in terms of attitudes there. And then the final point that I just want to mention is that there was, a couple years ago, we would have talked about the insurgency that is raging, and creeping extremism throughout society. And I think, as we've heard from both of our other presenters today, that extremism is no longer creeping throughout society, This is no longer a sort of a back burner issue. And it's not just those attitudes and those narratives, and the violence itself that is problematic. It's also, I would argue, the ratcheting effect that this is having between the different sects in Pakistan. I have long seen the Barelvi's involvement with the blasphemy issue, at least in part, as a sort of very calculated way of carving out space and pushing back against Deobandi militant groups, and that this was a way to sort of own a piece of the extremism pie, so to speak. And I think that we should be very, very concerned about the potential for a ratcheting effect among different sects in Pakistan, where they are each trying to sort of outflank the other in terms of the violence that they perpetrate and the messages that they put out there. And the other note that I would mention on that ratcheting is, I would agree with you that the overarching narrative that is problematic comes out of the security establishment, but I don't think we've seen nearly the pushback that we would want to see from the civilian government when it comes to those domestic narratives in terms of things like the blasphemy law and treatment of religious minorities and things like that. Civilians have been largely silent, either because they rely on some of these groups for vote banks or because they're scared. And so that, to me, is, I think, within Pakistan, the thing that I'm more concerned about in the future. And I'll come back to the issue of Islamist parties and the MML when I talk about the United States towards the end. The second sort of category of militant groups, and I'm coming at this, when I say anti-state, I'm coming at this from the perspective of the Pakistani state, right? How do they see the militant universe. And I think the second category I would term as frenemies, groups that have utility for the state but are also threatening to the state. And here, again, I think there is somewhat of a good news story in that 5 and certainly 10 years ago, there were a lot more frenemies. And as the term suggests, these were groups that threatened the state, but they were also groups that had some usefulness to the state and were sometimes supported or tolerated. I would put a number of TTP factions, right, the good TTP within those categories, elements of Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and others. I really think in the last couple of years, Pakistan has, as it has made progress against anti-state militant groups, it has also extended the fight to some of these other groups that used to fall into that frenemy camp. And that's something that, if current trends continue, I think probably continues to be the case, but it's a dynamic environment. It could change. What I think is more interesting is why that is the case, and that is that as Pakistan got a handle on the anti-state insurgency, at home, I think it was able to kind of engage in what I would term house cleaning, right? Going after groups that, if you fall into the frenemy category, might be useful to you but are kind of unreliable. And so why not clean house to the degree that you can? And that then leaves you with state-allied organizations, right? To the degree that you're trying to, if you're the Pakistani security establishment trying to turn back the clock to a time when the militants on your territory were, if not under your control, at least allied with you, and you had situational awareness again, of them, then you're trying to turn back the clock to that point. That leaves you with those state-allied organizations. And there, unfortunately, I think the past is kind of a predictor of the future, which is to say, there are still sanctuaries for the Taliban and the Haqqani network. There is still support for these actors. There is still support for Lashkar-e-Taiba. Jaish-e-Mohammed just launched an attack, several days ago in Indian-administered Kashmir. At least we think it was Jaish-e-Mohammed. Some of what you hear on the ground suggests that when it's Jaish-e-Mohammed, that really means that it was Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, but Jaish-e-Mohammed is the cat's paw that is pushed out there so that you can preserve Lashkar-e-Taiba. Gets difficult to suss out, but I think what we can be clear about is these groups have not disappeared. They are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Just a couple notes on that before I turn the page to the United States. The first is that I see the aid cut as doing very little to change Pakistan's calculus with regard to Taliban Haqqani network. And Lashkar-e-Taiba wasn't even really part of that conversation. The second is that I think the real catalytic event for shifts in the relationship, at least with regard to the Taliban and the Haqqanis, will come if and when the United States either withdraws from Afghanistan and we see how that plays out, or the United States gets its act together and actually begins to approach some sort of a political strategy to get some sort of a political settlement, and then we'll see, then we'll see what that next step is. But until then, I think we're a bit in sort of status quo ante. The other just piece that I want to mention there is the ISKP piece, Islamic State in Khorasan province, which is that a couple of years ago we would have been talking about ISKP and the Taliban as competitors. And that is, I think, we no longer can talk about them as just competitors. I think we have to talk to them about them as frenemies or competimates or whatever term you want to use, where they are still competing in some areas and they are collaborating in others. And, at least from people that I've spoken to when I was in Afghanistan earlier this year, some of this is ideological, some of this depends on state patronage, and some of this also, quite frankly, has a tribal component, which is in some places where, you have tribal competition, you have ISKP Taliban competition, and in other places where you don't have tribal competition, you don't have that taking place. And I think that's certainly something to keep an eye out as well in terms of where all this is headed. So what does that mean for the United States? Well, a couple things. One, in terms of Afghanistan, I'm not opposed on principle to suspending aid to Pakistan. I also could have done without the bluster. My concern with this is that it was done with potentially a degree of undue optimism, that this could that this could have an impact, that this won't lead to escalation, or that if the United States escalates, it's going to be able to control that escalation. And I also just haven't gotten a good answer yet for something which, quite frankly, I was one of the people struggling with this when I was in, DOD a few years ago, which is, if you actually get the Pakistanis to turn the corner in the short term, how do you ensure that they continue to move in the right direction over the long term, right? What happens if they start to behave the way you want them to? You turn aid back on, and then they, start kicking the can down the road again. I haven't seen a good answer to that. So that's one issue I have with the aid cut. The other is that I think it is indicative of a desire by the United States to really try to shift Pakistan's strategic calculus in ways that a lot of us believe the United States can't, because if the United States can't shift Pakistan's strategic calculus and get it to reduce support so that the United States can sort of browbeat the Taliban to the table, or get the Pakistanis to do it for us, then that kind of leaves the United States with no real strategy for Afghanistan. Because the United States has a military strategy for Afghanistan, and part of that military strategy is, for it to succeed, is, I think, predicated on the reduction of sanctuaries in Pakistan. If you can't reduce sanctuaries in Pakistan and support, then your military strategy doesn't work. And I haven't seen a political strategy yet. So I think that, to me, is a bigger concern in terms of what that aid cut potentially signifies. The other thing about the aid cut, which I think is a good thing, is that it shows resolve to Pakistan. It enhances credibility to U.S. credibility to Pakistan's neighbors, Afghanistan and India, and it suggests that the United States, at the very least, is no longer afraid that Pakistan's going to implode, right? 10 years ago, there was real concern that if you pushed the Pakistanis too hard, you're going to end up with a jihadist government, and I think we've sort of cured ourselves of those concerns. The flip side of that is we may have cured ourselves of those concerns at a time when, as we've heard, extremism is growing throughout Pakistan. And I think from the U.S. perspective, one of the questions we need to answer is, what happens if you have an Imran Khan government next year? What happens if U.S. access through Pakistan becomes an electoral issue, right? Pakistan may not cut off that access because the United States cuts aid, but what happens if that becomes an election issue? And then more broadly, just dealing with the fact that the United States has to live in the world where Pakistan also exists. And one way or another, the United States is going to have to find a way to engage, because the region is going to remain important, at least from a security perspective, for the foreseeable future. Even if we're not allies, even if we're not going to be close partners or close friends, we're going to have to find ways to engage. And I think a lot of what Dawood and especially Medea laid out in terms of those extremist attitudes is going to make it harder and harder to have that engagement over time. And then I'll close with this, and I think it's going to be one of the central conundrums that the United States is going to face. I think is typified by the MML. If you asked me a couple of years ago what I thought was the most likely way a group like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about, ends, I would say it ends by being mainstreamed, either through Jamaat-ud-Dawa as an above-ground organization, or it becomes a political party or something. That the way this most likely ends is you mainstream as many of the reconcilables as you can, and then you, if you're Pakistan, eliminate in one way or another the irreconcilables. And that's probably the most likely way it ends, right? Or it becomes some sort of a quasi-militia attached to the state or something, that somehow it is brought more within the mainstream system in ways that is going to make everybody uncomfortable, but nevertheless, right, that's probably the way that it stops being a terrorist organization. But I think for the United States, there's a couple challenges here. One is that from a policy perspective, no self-respecting U.S. policymaker is ever going to sanction this, because, right, from a terrorism policy, it can't be that you can go from being on our designated, right, terrorist group list and the UN list to suddenly being a viable political actor. The other is that it becomes very, very hard to tell if just because you become an Islamist party, you've stopped being a terrorist organization. I was in Pakistan a few years ago, and I was seeing, I will not say who, but I was sitting with a high-level official, and I was talking to him about the fact that members of different parties had been campaigning with militants from SSP and Sipi Sahaba Pakistan. And he said to me, Stephen, wouldn't you rather have these people involved in politics than involved in militancy? And I said, yes, I absolutely would. Problem is, you haven't forced them to choose. They can do both. And I think one of the real dangers, one of the real challenges for Pakistan and for the United States is going to be dealing with a country where there are, look, there's a lot of armed politics going on in Pakistan, but you're about to have potentially Islamist groups with direct tie, Islamist parties with direct ties to terrorist organizations that create a whole new set of challenges for the Pakistani state and for the United States to balance when it's trying to deal with that ongoing pre-existing set of challenges that exist there. So on that happy note, I will conclude.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And on that note of mainstreaming militants, when you discuss this with some Pakistanis, they'll say, oh, we don't need to worry about this because religious political parties never do well at the polls, which is true, but of course there's the bigger concern about how, mainstreaming them contributes to the broader concerns about extremism within society. So thank you to the three of you for some really excellent and troubling and depressing comments, but I think that'll lead us to open up to a nice discussion. First question that I'll just put to the three of you before we open it up. I think we can all agree that the battlefield fight, so to speak, has been effective, as all of you have discussed, that there simply have not been as many attacks. The Pakistani Taliban, the main anti-state threat, has been degraded significantly. Of course, some of its fighters moved into Afghanistan, but generally that's not a problem now. But as you all have underlined, the extremism concerns, radicalized society is just getting more and more concerning. I mean, as you said, Stephen, extremism is not creeping. It's a clear and present danger. So my question is, do we need to worry that in time, if this trend continues to play out, we could essentially revert to the killing fields of 2007 to 2014, where you have new terrorists that are formed, new anti-state terrorists, and that you have the terrible things play out that happened over that 7-year period in recent times? And if so, how would that figure, or how would that make the Pakistani state, particularly the security establishment, think about how to deal with these threats? So it's a hypothetical, of course, it's speculative, but I figured I'd throw that out there if anyone wants to address it.
That's a great question. Do you want to go, Dawood? Or my sense is that to the extent that Pakistan's security establishment and the military remains powerful, which, it will, it's not going to allow these groups that exist right now to get to quite that stage, though we could see an increase in violence undertaken even by groups like TLY-RA, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, Ya Rasulallah. We could see that happening, but my sense is that the kind of existential threat that the TTP posed to the state really, that took, in some ways, it took decades, right? It started from the 80s, the 90s, and then by the end of the 2000s, it became what it did. My sense is that the security establishment has learned enough from that experience that it will not allow that to happen. The problem is that in doing so, they're giving in. So I think one of the reasons why at the end of last year, the state, signed this deal with the Tehreek-e-Labbaik, Ya Rasulallah, was exactly because it was scared and also did not engage in sort of a violent shutdown of the protest, was because it was scared of the repercussions of the Red Mosque operation that Musharraf had undertaken in 2007, which is, what really led to the Taliban insurgency in many ways, sort of taking off fully and coming out openly against the state. So, I've quotes in my book from sort of that time where Abdulaziz is saying, thanks to Musharraf for allowing us to finally declare war on the state, and we saw the increase in violence after that. So I think the worrisome answer is that extremism will increase because there will be more giving into such groups, but violence may not go up to that level.
Anyone else want to address that?
Yeah, just a word about that. I agree with Madiha. Extremism may continue, but violence, I would say that no. Because there were the times when the Taliban came into power, I would say, and they captured several cities. At that time, they were at least having the sympathies of the society, because the history of the Afghan Taliban was very new. And then the Afghan Taliban were removed from power. And this also generated a kind of sympathy inside the Pakistani society, because I'm witness to that. In 2001, we were seeing protest demonstrations in support of the Afghan Taliban in the Pakistani cities. But come to the killing of Osama bin Laden, no one would say that I have seen any protest demonstration in support of Al-Qaeda or Taliban. Come to the operations against the Taliban groups, whether that is in Swat or that is in South Waziristan or that is in North Waziristan or Khyber or Bajaur or Mumand, any tribal agency, there was no support or no protest demonstration in support of the Taliban. So like in Peshawar, Stephen might be a witness to that. If you are meeting at that time in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, a tangawala or a rickshawala and ask them that what is your opinion about the Taliban? And they would say that, well, they are the emancipator and we want to come and implement the Islamic system in this country. But now, if you go to the cities and ask someone, and they would say that, no, Taliban, no, because they have seen the real face of the Taliban terrorism and the threat and the losses, and particularly after the Peshawar school attack, what happened, that was a kind of watershed. Now, there is a widespread hatred, and I won't say that this widespread hatred is only in Pakistan. This is also in Afghanistan, and this is one of my reasons that ISIS is also not going to grow in power in Afghanistan. One of the reasons. Secondly, Pakistan military also gone through a very bad experience by supporting such kind of groups, and I think they may be. The extremism may continue, but to grow to the level of posing another threat, a revival of the Pakistani Taliban, which were present in the organizational structure in the cities, I think that is not a possibility as long as the Pakistani government openly, or the Pakistani military openly permit them to do so.
I would just add, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the TTP insurgency that developed did not develop overnight, right? It was given a lot of running room in terms of the ability to organize. I think we're unlikely to see allowing that level of militant organization again, where you're sort of taking a hands-off approach. We're much more likely to see the security services step in to nip it in the bud. I would agree with that. I would also that, right, if one looks at, I hate to draw comparisons with other countries, but if one looks at Algeria, the memory of the civil war during the 1990s appears to, have repeatedly acted as a check sometimes on insurgent violence since then, and that may be the case in Pakistan as well. But I would again, I think there's two things that we should be cognizant of. One is that you can have a catalytic event where that organizing has been taking place in different ways in terms of Islamist parties and things like that. And I think a lot of people are surprised that Egypt has an insurgency right now, because for a lot of years it didn't. But if we look at what the indicators were, we shouldn't be. Right? The catalytic event was the Arab uprisings, and now they have an insurgency because a lot of the risk factors were left unaddressed for so long. And then the other is just, we tend to focus on Fatah-based insurgents, and I think there's really open questions about what happens if and when Pakistan ever tries to do something about groups like LET and JEM and SSP, and whether you have, if not a full-on guerrilla warfare insurgency, a uptick in urban terrorism in Pakistan because of how those groups respond to whatever Pakistani actions are.
Thanks. Well, let's open it up to you all. Please wait until you have a microphone. Please wait until you're called on, and please wait until you have a microphone in your hand so that people listening on the live stream around the world can actually hear your brilliant question. And please keep it to a question as well, in the interest of time. Yeah, we'll start with you, sir. Right in front of you, Atif. Yep. And please identify yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Stephen Engelken. I work at Foreign Service Institute. I was very interested in the discussion here about the appearance in the last year or so of Islamist parties who are associated with the Brelvi Islamic sect, that's one of the things that's new. And the incident outside of Islamabad, and I guess it was November, where the government just backed down rather than enforce the law, was really striking to me, particularly when the army, as I recall it, basically told the government it would not assist the government in enforcing the law, which left me with the question that you always get for anything in Pakistan. To what extent is the army, what is the relationship between the army and these new Brelvi-based extremist groups? Do we think the army is supporting them? Do we think there are other more mainstream political parties that support them? I mean, we all know that the SSP had links with various established political parties. Do these?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say no. The army is not supporting particularly this protest demonstration of Khadim Hussain Rizvi, or what is called Tehreek-e-Labbaik Ya Rasulullah in Rawalpindi on the Faizabad Square. Yes, when I would say that, did the army adopted a meaningful silence, I would say yes. And if you ask me why, my response would be there was something more involved, was to humble the civilian government. That is my response.
Go ahead.
I would tend to agree with Dawood's last point. I mean, I think, the army uses, so Pakistan's Islamists and the fringe elements that get to be sort of the extremist, fundamentalist Islamist parties, if you will, like this TLY RA party, are not electorally strong, but they have been used by both Pakistan's military and by Pakistan's civilian governments. By Pakistan's military as sort of a pawn against its civilian governments, right? And so here, it was certainly a way to weaken the writ of the civilian government. Pakistan's civilian governments use them to, because they have street power to garner votes as coalition partners when they are electorally weak and they need some support. So I guess that's one thing. And then the second thing is, that I would go back to the fact that both Pakistan's civilian and military governments have really relied on religion for legitimacy and power. But one should note that Pakistan's, the motto of the Pakistani army, right, is Iman, Taqwa, Jihad. So it's faith, piety, holy war. And it uses religion not ideologically. It uses religion as a tool to both, signify and justify its opposition to India. And that's the opposition to India is what gives it sustenance, right? So we can't underestimate how the Pakistani military is going to continue to see Islamist groups as a powerful tool.
Yes.
Yes, I'm Sufi Lagari with the Sindhi Foundation. When Pakistani state itself is sponsoring terrorism and extremism, I don't know how you're going to contain it. And you said that to give the money to the civilian, when the civilian government itself, they are corrupt, like Panama, Nawaz Sharif, or the Mr. 10%, and even Mr. Imran Khan gave 300 million to Darul Uloom Haqqaniya. So I don't know, and he's also famous, Mr. Taliban Khan. I don't know how you're going to describe these things.
Does anyone want to comment on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so Imran Khan is a different story, and we can talk about the hypothetical, right? You know, when he is in power, you know, we can talk about it. One thing I will say is that KPK is implementing and has been, you know, for this is the fascinating thing about Pakistan. The civilian governments, even the MMA government, the alliance of 6 religious Islamist parties that actually won in what was then the NWFP, now is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in 2002, when it realized that its Islamizing agenda wasn't going anywhere, it actually, took money from DFID and opened up girls' schools. And did a good job with that, right? I mean, it did a whole host of other things. It let the Taliban Pakistan Insurgency develop and so on. So, I'm not going to say that it was not harmful. But when it comes to kind of a development agenda, Imran Khan's current KP government is, again, going along with donor-funded and assisted development. And DFID is doing a lot in KP. So my point is, with civilian aid and Nawaz Sharif's government and now the new prime minister. I mean, they're different. So corruption is something different, but these the PMLN in particular, and I'm sure the PPP, if it was in power too, has explicitly in the last few years tried to show tried to distance itself from the state, from the security establishment's alleged support of, the LET or the Haqqani network of the Afghan Taliban. It has repeatedly tried to distance itself, right? And what makes these civilian governments the military has used that distancing to sort of put down the civilian governments and weaken them. And the fact that the U.S. has been sort of giving aid only and primarily to the military establishment only props up the military establishment vis-a-vis the civilian government. So to the extent that we can, from this end, tip that the scale a little bit in favor of the civilian government, which has tried to distance itself from the sponsoring of terrorist groups, we're in a better position. I'm not saying this is the end, right? This is the end game. That's not the case. But I will say that, corruption notwithstanding, I mean, nobody's going to argue that these guys are perfect. Nawaz Sharif was a protege of Ziaul Haq, I mean, nobody's going to argue that. But to the extent that we have to look for some silver lining, some hope somewhere, it's not with the military.
Stephen?
Yeah, just a couple quick points. I mean, I think also when we're talking about aid, and this, by the way, goes for development aid, economic aid, or security assistance, it really goes down to what it is that you're trying to accomplish with that assistance. And the United States, when it provides assistance, first and foremost, is pursuing U.S. national interests. And so, is the United States trying to remake Pakistan with that aid? No, it's not. I would point to several reasons for why you continue civilian assistance, and also I'll throw in why I would have been an advocate for reducing but not ending security assistance. One, if you end all assistance, then you pretty much are returning to the 1990s when you have, really, almost no engagement whatsoever. Because assistance is a form of engagement, whether you think it's good or bad, it is. Two, to entirely cut off all aid, to my mind, further undercuts the would-be reformers that do exist in Pakistan. Three, I would suggest that I don't think that our assistance is doing a lot for us from a public diplomacy point of view right now. I've always been, a believer that we could do that a lot better. But ending it entirely, takes you in the opposite direction. And I think when you ultimately have to engage with Pakistan again, which the United States will, it makes it all that more difficult to engage. And I'll just add on the security assistance side, those arguments I think are operative there as well. I was, and I'm on record on this in numerous different written forums, saying that I thought the United States should have ended coalition support funds, and it should have, reduced security assistance and placed new conditions on it that were much more realistic than the ones that we had on it in the past, and then enforced them. And that would have allowed some degree of ongoing engagement, a little bit of a foundation for the mill-to-mill relationship, without sacrificing U.S. credibility or bolstering the military at the civilians' expense. Again, those are ways in which I think countries use assistance. The aim, sadly, is not to cure Pakistan of its corruption problem.
State-sponsored terrorism, extremism.
What's that?
State-sponsored extremism and state-sponsored
So,
terrorism.
I don't think that anybody could argue from an academic perspective that Pakistan sponsors terrorism. I wrote a piece for the Washington Quarterly arguing against labeling Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism, in which I think in the opening paragraph I said Pakistan is by any definition a state sponsor of terrorism. But the U.S. instrument whereby you designate a country a state sponsor of terrorism is, that's not a surgical instrument. That's a really, really heavy hammer. And the sanctions that come with that pretty much, obliterates any chance you have for engaging on a whole host of other issues. And once you get onto that list, it's really hard to get off of that list. So I'm not going to bore everybody with it here, but I've written in other forums about, various other mechanisms that the United States could use short of designation that, begin to chip away at that issue.
Other questions? Let's go all the way to the back. The gentleman with the blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Mutaya Alagapa. I'm with American University. My question is, this extremism, is it spread all over Pakistan or is it in specific provinces? And what is the link to ethnic insurgent movements? Thank you.
Go ahead, Dowd. Do you want to take that?
Well, if you look at Pakistan, there are some pockets where we can find the level of extremism is higher than the rest. But it exists. In one degree or another degree, it exists at different levels. Somewhere it is higher, somewhere it is lower. For example, as Stephen mentioned, some cities of Punjab province, like the southern Punjab, so we can find some sectarian extremism there. Similarly, when we come to the tribal areas, since these areas are the very closely bordering Afghanistan, and since 1979, a war is going on there. It's taking different shapes, like from jihad, it turns into civil war, it turns into warlordism, then it turns into Talibanization. From Talibanization, we can say that after 9/11, it was a neo-Taliban and now ISIS. So there is a kind of spread of extremism in the tribal areas and the adjacent Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. So it's a degree. We don't have like to mention with specifically that where it is more, where it is less, but generally I can say that it is not the same everywhere. Some level is existing. What was the second question? That's fine.
That was it.
That was it. Okay.
Go ahead.
Second question was whether, in fact,
I didn't know there was.
Yeah, there was.
it interlinked with ethnic separation.
Yeah,
Yes, sorry.
No, I think there is some misunderstanding. We don't see any kind of ethnic movement in Pakistan. There were the times like the 70s or 60s, or there were some movements, some very active movement, and there may be grievances in Pakistan by the ethnic groups, for example, the minority Baloch or Pashtun. Yeah, Baloch movement is there. There are some fighting going on in Balochistan, but it is very little links with the extremist trends in Pakistan.
If I can add, I cut the attitudes by province, and what you see is that Punjabis, people in Punjab, respondents in Punjab in these polls had the most extreme attitudes towards a whole host of variables that I looked at, right? So views towards terrorist groups and so on, and negative views towards India, the US, and so on. So Punjab was definitely the most extreme of relative to the other provinces. And when I interviewed students in universities in Punjab, in Lahore, there were a lot of hostilites, people students who had come in from other provinces and were studying for their master's or bachelor's degrees. The most liberal views, the most the views that least followed Pakistan's kind of nationalist narrative that I've heard anywhere in the country were from students who were either from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or Balochistan. Sindhis are pretty tolerant and liberal relatively to the other provinces, when it comes to views. I would argue that there is some relation between views and ethnicity, in the sense that the Pakistani state has, Punjab is sort of the hegemonic province, if you will. The Punjabi, in many ways, because it's so large and so prosperous, and because the army comes mostly from it, and the bureaucracy comes mostly from it, it kind of runs the country. And Punjab has really, in many ways, become Pakistan. And so, yes, there are grievances in the other provinces. In Balochistan's insurgency, Pakistanis don't even know what is going on in Balochistan, because there have been 5 insurgencies. The 5th one is ongoing. We have no idea what's happening, because we are not allowed to, the Pakistanis are not allowed to see what's going on there. But the other provinces buy less into kind of the nationalist narrative and the sort of the conservative elements to which the nationalist narrative has been drawn over the past few decades. Some of the sort of the trends I've laid out. The other provinces buy less into it, and Punjabis buy more into it, which is what explains these results.
I think what's so concerning about extremism in Pakistan is not only the geographic issue, the geographic spread, but the socioeconomic spread. And I think everyone would agree that, this is, and of course this is not unique to Pakistan. You have plenty of middle class and upper class militants. You look at the top leaders of the Pakistani Taliban, and you see those that had been journalists, that had been, in the case of Mullah Fazlullah, the current head of the group, he had operated a chairlift in Swat at one point. Not wealthy, but he was not poor. And I think perhaps the most sobering example was the young man that confessed to killing Sabine Mahmood, who was a human rights activist based in Karachi. He had thrown his allegiances to ISIS or maybe Al Qaeda. He apparently had been radicalized when he was doing an internship at the Unilever Corporation. He had gone to IBA, one of the most prestigious universities in Pakistan. So anyway, these are concerning issues too. Next question. Let's go to Marvin, and then we'll go to the other side of the room. So right here.
Marvin Weinbaum, the Middle East Institute. I'm wondering if, in looking at extremism, we ought to see it as a more subtle, insidious phenomenon, in the sense that what was for most time, narratives which we associated with the fringes have become mainstream. And that these set the tone now. I'm sure you've run into this as well. You meet educated, sophisticated people in Pakistan who espouse thoughts that you would have associated here with the most radical elements, such that when we talk about these groups becoming more mainstream, perhaps, you have to say, well, in a sense, haven't they already made the kinds of inroads here which have changed the society and therefore create the parameters in which the decision makers are going to be working in, regardless of which party, at a time when the parties, I'm sure also throw this in, parties are in a kind of disarray, which makes the whole system then more malleable, I would think.
Good point. Stephen, you know?
Yes.
It's a real Washington
yeah,
answer.
I agree with you. I think they have. I think what we define as mainstream today looks different than what we would have defined as mainstream 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right? Mainstream has slid to the right, and that has happened for a whole host of reasons. You know, the fact that Hafiz Saeed is reinventing himself as a statesman and is able to go on television, right, is, I mean, it's absolutely insane to me. And yet, at the same time, having been, you know, working on Pakistan for a while, it's not at all insane to me. You know, I think I would agree with you. Yes. And I would add that some of this is a lot of this, I think, and you know, Medea's done you know, great work on this, that a lot of this is down to the narratives that the state has promoted and to the way in which the state has created the game. But I would also suggest that we overlook the degree to which this is not always uniform, right? That competition that exists between the different parties, between different politicians, between the civilians and the military also creates space for a lot of these actors, right? Because they become more important power brokers. I'll go back to Hafiz Saeed. For a long time, I thought he was an important political player, even if he wasn't a politician, right? That Pakistan has that the competition that's taking place among all those different actors creates space for these people to emerge as power brokers, to arrogate power to themselves, and then I think finally you get fear, right? The fear of cracking down when you have a mass protest, you know, the fear of closing down. I've talked to so many civilian politicians who said, yes, we know what's going on in that mosque or madrasa. We don't want to close it down. We don't want another red mosque. We don't want to have the streets shut down with protest. There's fear. So there's a top-down issue that's going on. There's competition among all these different actors that's creating space, and there's fear. And I think, yeah, the ultimate outcome of that is, my answer to your question is yes. The concept of mainstream has shifted, and I don't see it shifting back.
But also a bottom up here.
Yes, well, I mean, I think there's been growing religiosity around the world, and you know that happens in Pakistan as well. But it's not right. That bottom up has to have space to play and has to be helped along. And I think these other issues that I'm pointing to, right, have created that space and have helped it along.
If I can add, you know, in a discussion that's been sobering, negative, you know, and you know, which is certainly in some ways the majority of the picture. I agree completely that obviously the you know the right the mainstream has moved to the extreme towards intolerance and so on. But in Pakistan, there is, as you mentioned, Marvin, you know, there's sort of this sophisticated kind of elite, you know, you see many of the members of that elite, having migrated to the U.S. or going to universities here. It's tiny, it's minute, but that has stayed where it is and you mentioned some, I'm sure some of them espouse conspiracy theories, et cetera, and so on. But there is if you read Pakistan's Dawn newspaper, or if you read Pakistan's, sort of, if you go on Twitter and read some of the things the prominent journalists in Pakistan say, if you look at people like Asma Jahangir, who passed away just Sunday, I mean, there is a minute but very vocal and strong minority in Pakistan that has the right idea for the country, and that is, fighting as hard as it can. And to me, the two findings I had, which sort of lend some hope for Pakistan's future, are actually students who did not belong to this elite in universities, where I had, we had fantastic discussions, but these are students who were doing their master's or their bachelor's in political science or history. I mean, so, not engineering or med school, where they tend to have sort of these very black and white ideas about Pakistan, the way they've been, sort of taught from middle school, high school onwards. They really had sort of very progressive ideas for the country. So, I think university education, getting students beyond the hump of the bad education they get in these public high schools is sort of one idea. And I think then the other is sort of engaging, solidly in curriculum reform, because, again, for students who actually study in the O-level system, that's where there's some selection bias there for sure, but that's where that's a British system. That's where and in Pakistan, that's where we actually really see attitudes, textbooks being very different, attitudes being very, very different. And to the extent that we can take the lessons and spread them through the mainstream public education system, politically, it's not feasible in at least 2 of the provinces, but we could do it in a couple of the provinces and see if it works.
Bill Milam.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Bill Milam. I am a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. And I wanted to first make a comment, which Ms. Asphalt touched on, Afzal, and that was about Asma Jahangir, who died day before yesterday, who was a pillar in this elite that resists the growing narrative. But my experience of the friends I have, who mainly friends in that petite slice of the society, is that they are afraid to speak out. Most of my friends who used to go on television to debate mullahs or whoever was coming from the other side are now afraid to do so because of all the death threats they're doing. Mm-hmm. Asma never was afraid. She used to go on and she'd take them on, and she survived a number of assassination attempts and a much larger number of death threats that were never carried out. But so that's, I think, not a real something I would really count on very much in helping reverse this narrative. But I did want to ask a question, and that's why I took the microphone. And it's really, I'm being a devil's advocate here, and mainly pointing towards Stephen, who I remember well from when he was here. Our government, rightly or wrongly, has taken a much harder view about Pakistan. And whether you read the tweets and believe them or not, it's clear that there are a number of people in this government or advising this government who want to go to what I would call the extreme in putting pressure on it to do what we would like it to do. And I've heard a very powerful argument. First of all, I've argued, and I don't believe many of us really wouldn't argue that what we're proposing in terms of aid cuts, military cuts, those compensatory payment cuts, and so forth, are going to do anything to move the Pakistani government, the military really, to take a different look at things differently, which gets to your military and political strategy. We have a military strategy in Afghanistan and no political strategy, and the political strategy ought to be in Pakistan, but wouldn't putting maximum pressure on Pakistan include declaring them a state sponsor of terrorism? And I've heard powerful arguments for that to be done, and I want your reaction to that.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. So first, let me be clear. By any academic by any definition, Pakistan is supporting terrorism. So why don't we? And you're right. That would enable us to exert maximum pressure. Once you've declared them a state sponsor of terrorism, if they don't then take the actions that the United States wants them to, then what? Now you've you've dropped the hammer, and it hasn't worked, and they're on that list for, look, Sudan was on for how long, right? And it becomes that much harder to engage in a whole host of ways. It now, if they start, and say they do start to take the actions that you want them to take in Afghanistan, and you wanted to reward Pakistan, right, because this is a give and take, now you can't, because you've declared them a state sponsor of terrorism and you've put sanctions on them, and most of the relationship has been cut off, because you're really not talking to the military anymore, and there's not a whole lot you can do for them in those regards. My issue with the state sponsorship of terrorism is that it's such a blunt instrument that once it's used, it's very hard to unuse, and it precludes engagement in a lot of other areas. My other issue is that research has shown, historically, threats of coercion are useful for deterrence or useful for sort of immediate action, right? That's how we got immediate action from Pakistan after 9/11. But they're not nearly as useful when you're trying to compel a country to do something over a long period of time, right? And it takes a long period of time to reduce and ultimately end support for the Taliban and the Haqqani network. Nobody expects that to happen overnight. And it's also very, very difficult to use coercion to compel a country to end its support for terrorist groups when that support is not just strategic but also ideological. And I would argue that what Pakistan is trying to accomplish in Afghanistan is in many ways, right, goes to the heart of Pakistan's ideology about how it sees itself in its neighborhood. So for all of those reasons, I'm skeptical of using designation because I don't think it would work. And I think it then closes down potential avenues for engagement going forward. I think Pakistan has ways in which to respond, by the way, right? It can escalate against us the same way we can escalate against the Pakistanis. And then if it did work in terms of moving Pakistan off the dime and getting them to actually begin taking action, you've now taken a step where it's hard to engage with them when they're doing the right thing. So I see it as a very, very blunt instrument that doesn't leave a lot of room for maneuver afterwards. This has less to do with Pakistan than it does with my own personal assessment of state designation of state sponsor of terrorism as a very, very low utility instrument of statecraft, unless you're dealing with a country where you really don't have a lot of engagement anyway, right? It's fine. We declare Iran a state sponsor of terrorism. Okay. We're not trying to get access through Iran into Pakistan, right? Although if we could, then that would solve a lot of our Pakistan problems, right? Get access through Iran into Afghanistan. And, so for all of those reasons, I would add on top of that, there's a whole host of other things that we can do in between cutting aid and declaring them a state sponsor of terrorism, right? There's a lot of measures that we could be taking, both positive and negative, that might sort of move them in that right direction. But ultimately, and this is my opinion, what's really going to change Pakistan's behavior with regard to Afghanistan is going to be when we get our act together and we have a political strategy that accounts for their concerns there without giving in to Pakistan. Doesn't mean that Pakistan gets to sort of write the settlement agreement. It means that they are one of the players at the table. They can't be cut out of this. And I would argue that the desire to put maximum pressure on Pakistan comes from the mistaken belief that we can browbeat the Pakistanis enough and the Pakistanis can browbeat the Taliban enough that we can get to the table in a couple of years' time before patience here runs out. And that what we're really looking for, what this administration is looking for from people that I've spoken to in it, is not so much a political settlement as a Taliban capitulation. And I find that to be as just entirely unrealistic.
If it's 30 seconds.
Sorry, that was a long answer, but yeah.
It was a good answer, though.
It was a good answer, yeah. But what do we do when, after 2 years, nothing has happened with all these sanctions except the state sponsor of terrorism one that people are proposing? I mean, what happens when we run out of patience in a couple of years and decide to pull out of Afghanistan?
Probably chaos and instability. I don't, I mean,
I agree with
right,
that.
which would be why, right? Look, as somebody who was not opposed, I was not opposed to the troop increase, and to troops being able to fight down to the, our U.S. forces being able to advise and assist down to the Kandak level for Afghans. We saw how that could work in Iraq. That's, not opposed to additional enablers, not opposed to any of those things. But the military piece has always been the piece that we could get right easiest. That doesn't do any good if you don't have a political strategy for engaging the Taliban, for engaging Pakistan, and for dealing with sort of, Afghan politics. And that's just the part where when I say, okay, well, what's plan B if you can't beat the Taliban into submission, I get blank stares. So I'm sure they're working on it. I would argue work faster. These types of negotiated settlements, this, take a long period of time. We should be, I'm personally a believer that the United States should be talking to the Taliban tomorrow, in one form or another, that this is going to take some time and that we shouldn't be waiting until we're like sort of in the catbird seat. For 10 years now, I've been hearing like, we just need to be sort of, in a better position of strength, and then we can go ahead and do it. Do it already.
If you think this administration is working on Plan B, I've got a very big book that I'd like to talk to you about.
Dawood, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm hearing this argument quite frequently here about the state sponsor of terrorism. But as Stephen mentioned it, let us declare Pakistan today as a state sponsor of terrorism. But what next? If there is no change in Pakistan behavior, what will be the next approach? Would that continue with that, or some more serious step is going to be taken? And secondly, if you continue giving aid to Pakistan, till how long? That is the question. Let us come to the second approach, and let's say that continue giving aid to the Pakistan and Pakistan's military, and still Pakistan is not coming to cooperation in Afghanistan. So till how long? Why not? I believe that there is right now on both sides, in Pakistan and the United States, I think there is a kind of disconnect, and a lot of mistrust is creeping in, and it's keeping the two sides from coming closer to each other. But the best option, I believe, that why don't you sit with Pakistan once and for all and to know Pakistan's concerns? What are your genuine concerns? If Pakistan has any concerns, for example, from my reporting, I can hear from people that I'm speaking to in Pakistan. I'll just mention that. Pakistan has some concerns, for example. Pakistan concern is that if today the United States wins the war in Afghanistan and it goes out, what is going to happen to Pakistan inside Afghanistan? Does that mean India is coming in to replace Pakistan? That is one concern. I won't say that it is a genuine concern or it's a baseless concern. I won't say that, but this is a concern. Second concern is that if the United States loses the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan comes to the support of that losing war, so Pakistan is going to lose the Taliban. That is Pakistan's, at one time it was considered as Pakistan's strategic assets. So these are Pakistan concerns. I won't comment on that. Are these genuine concerns or are these baseless concerns? But these are the concerns.
Got time for one more question. If we could, okay, let's go over here. Yep.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm with the State Department. We've talked a lot about the bilateral relationship, but there are other actors in the region, of course, and some of those are considered positive, especially China. So the Chinese-Pakistan relationship is generally referred to as the all-weather friendship. If that's the case, then what's China's role in countering extremism?
Anyone?
Yeah,
wanna
I mean, I think adding on to a few comments from the last couple of questions and this, there are avenues which take a less sort of single-minded approach that this administration has taken, sort of only focused on the Haqqanis. There are avenues to actually make Pakistan move that also deal with the whole picture. And China is sort of, we need to think about China, we need to think about India, we need to think about extremism in Pakistan as a whole, and so on. So China can put pressure on Pakistan, and Pakistan will listen. The US can put pressure on China to put pressure on Pakistan to make it listen. Very, very simply, because we are running out of time. India, the Trump administration sort of mentioning India as, sort of wanting India to be involved in Afghanistan just raises alarm bells in Pakistan and in Pakistan's security establishment. That does not help matters at all if it wants Pakistan to cooperate in terms of the Haqqani network. So that kind of language, or if there is action that's going to follow that language, is entirely unhelpful. And I would say the third thing that the US can do is in terms of other sort of avenues, such as sort of this little known or little discussed action that it took to put Pakistan on a watch list for violations of religious freedom. Things like that actually will make Pakistan move on sort of countering or looking at extremism more, because Pakistan cares deeply about how it's talked about, how it's portrayed in the world. And so if you put Pakistan on the list for, violations of religious freedom, which, for instance, the Obama administration had not wanted to do, trying to maintain this relationship with Pakistan, that will make Pakistan move on some of the other dimensions of extremism. And that may actually take care of start taking care of its relationship with terrorist groups as well. So I think sort of looking at other avenues for involvement is sort of the way to go.
Just briefly, I just want to add a few points on China, right? Because I know that I think for years now, people have been looking to China as potentially a key that would help unlock the solution to this problem, and I'm skeptical that that's going to pay off the way we want it to. And I would say first that China's historic approach to counterterrorism in Pakistan, has essentially amounted to go get me that Uyghur, right? It's not like we want to deal with the entire militant infrastructure. It's not like Beijing is like, how do we get rid of the militant infrastructure in Pakistan? It's how do we capture or kill the guys that are a direct threat to us, and we are going to maintain our ties with some of the other organizations in the area. The second point I would make is that I think the Belt and Road Initiative, right, and all the investment in CPEC potentially, right, changes the game, but not necessarily, I think, in the way that the United States might like, in that, from what I've seen, and there are others who know more about this than I do, but from what I've seen, China's approach to dealing with terrorism and extremism in Pakistan, now that it is investing so much more, has just been sort of, go get me that Uyghur, expanded, which is, here's where we're going to be. We want you to protect where we're going to be. We're not necessarily going to, right, be sort of putting pressure on you across the board. And I think it's important to remember, right, China's approach to all countries, including Pakistan, which is one of its really its only friends, is not to meddle in those internal dynamics, not to tell other countries how to govern themselves. That's one of the reasons why countries like doing business with China, is that you don't get, right, the hidden costs of values and things like that that come along with it. And I also, do I think that we should be engaging China on this? Sure. I'll be honest, I'm skeptical that we can pressure China. And I'm also skeptical that pressuring China on Pakistan is really at the top of the list in terms of the things that we're trying to get China to accomplish right now. Right? There's people in this administration have a bigger fish to fry in terms of what they're trying to get China to do closer to home in terms of North Korea. So for all of those reasons, I'm just, look. We struggle to get China to not block designations of Haqqani members at the United Nations. I'm skeptical that they're going to really carry U.S. water in Pakistan. Sorry.
So in other words, China can effectively get Pakistan to go after the terror groups that are perceived as the biggest threat to China, and which may be one reason why China had a hand in maybe not pressuring, but encouraging Pakistan to launch that Zarb-e-Azam, which did target ETIM, as I understand it.
Well, just to add a very brief comment, if you go through the Declaration of Heart of Asia conference, I think it was last year, and China was signatory to that conference. So the most powerful statement against extremism and terrorism came from that forum, and China was included there. So that means China is very much interested. Secondly, if we go to the role of China in that area, China has a goodwill in all the sides. Like Taliban leadership last year visited Chinese officials and they met them, and they were designated as the guarantors, although the proposal was not finalized at that time. Secondly, China, Pakistan, they have their friendship of taller than mountains and deeper than oceans and even sweeter than honey. So, yeah. And then if we go to, for example, the Taliban have a very, like, they believe and they trust China to some extent, so that could be a guarantor in that case. Going to Stephen's comments, like China is asking Pakistan to get the Uyghur. In 2014, June 14, 2014, when Pakistan launched the Operation Zarb-e-Azam, so it is generally believed that maybe it was because of the U.S. pressure, although they resisted the U.S. pressure for several years to launch an operation in North Waziristan. But there was the involvement of Chinese pressure because there were the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement militants in that area. And now that they are expelled, now the new situation is becoming in Afghanistan, where the ETIM militants, they are joining the ISIS for their survival. It is the Islamic movement of Afghanistan and the ETIM who are joining the Islamic State of Khorasan province for their survival. And the pressure will definitely be coming from China. And recently the news reports are that they are constructing or they are supporting a military base in Badakhshan province of Afghanistan.
We may have to convene another event on changing patterns of extremism and terrorism in Afghanistan. Well, as we wrap up, just very quickly, wanted to go back to something that Bill Milam had said before about the late Asma Jehangir. She had spoken here at the Wilson Center in 2005. Some of us in the room were here, and she said something that day, and I remember she was sitting right where Madiha is now. She said something that I think goes to this issue of fear and how it's going to be so difficult to deal with this problem of extremism. She said, if you support the establishment, meaning the security establishment, the sky is the limit. You can kill, you can corrupt. And she said, if you oppose the establishment, you won't be able to enjoy an honest day's work. So it's a pretty sobering, pretty powerful statement. This was in 2005 at the height of military rule in Pakistan. But anyway, don't mean to end on a downer. So I will say that this was a terrific discussion. It has been a downer all day. It's been a terrific discussion. I think we should give a round of applause for our three panelists.